I'm here with Professor Steven Pike. Professor, thank you so much for being here.
Connor, thanks. It's a pleasure to be here today with you.
So we received the news that Secretary of State Rex Tillerson is now the former Secretary of State, fired by President Trump. He came in as sort of an unorthodox figure, being a CEO of Exxon and having various connections through that career path. There was some hope that, that sort of unorthodoxy would lead to a successful tenure, but apparently not. What went wrong?
Well, indeed, when Secretary Tillerson arrived at the State Department, there was actually quite a lot of optimism. The State Department's got a long track record of working with ambassadors from outside of the Foreign Service, outside of the diplomatic corps, and here came the CEO of one of the largest multinational corporations on earth, a big organization with lots of branch offices overseas. Gee, sounded kind of like the State Department. And most of the professional diplomats said, hey, this guy's got to be pretty savvy, he's got to have some experience, we can definitely work with this. So there was a lot of optimism as to who the new Secretary of State might turn out to be. Unfortunately, it didn't quite pan out over the course of that year. I would say that there's going to be a lot of speculation on this, but I think Secretary Tillerson probably made two significant mistakes. And the first one is he got some bad advice. He got some bad advice that the State Department needed to be pruned severely. This led him to isolate himself from the staff, to take a very sort of adversarial stance toward a lot of the professionals at the department, and then to walk in and tell Congress, I want a 30% cut. I think that he started to see that maybe he had gotten some bad advice when Congress said, no, you're not going to get a 30% cut. You'll get 3%, which in Washington terms is really not that significant. And I think the second mistake he made relates to that. He really didn't understand that your board of directors when you're a cabinet secretary is Congress. He didn't invest the time to build the relationship with members of Congress that a cabinet secretary really needs to succeed in Washington, and it just kind of caught up with him. The last thing I think that where there was an essential disconnect is really between the classic disconnect between the White House and Foggy Bottom. You have a president and a secretary of state who really turned out to have very different perspectives on what foreign policy should be and how foreign policy ought to be executed. And the president and the secretary had some really significant policy differences on a wide variety of things. And I think, if the president felt he was not going to get the reaction, the advice, or the action from his Secretary of State that he particularly wanted, well, at the end of the day, if it comes down to it's the president versus the secretary, the president wins. Sorry. So the secretary is out, and we'll have a new one.
So you mentioned the disconnect between Tillerson and President Trump, and they disconnected on a number of issues, from the Iran deal to how best to deal with the fallout with Russia after the 2016 election meddling. You mentioned in an article in the Huffington Post that you wrote that you believe that the straw that really broke the camel's back here was disagreement on how best to handle the UK's expulsion of those Russian diplomats following the poisoning of the Russian spy. Why was that the final straw?
Always remember that when you're talking about the straw that breaks the camel's back, there's already a lot of straw on the back and it's already creaking and groaning. I tend to think that this one casts in relief the disconnect between two directions of policy. And I think you saw that direction of policy yesterday when the president congratulated Vladimir Putin for his win in an election that is at best described as dubious. It's a sham election, but here we are congratulating somebody who just won a rigged election. That's a violation of pretty much every principle of public diplomacy and American foreign policy values that we've tried to project for 100 years or more. But the secretary came out. He clearly took the side of the UK, which is pretty much what any of us international relations and public diplomacy folks would expect. And within hours of saying the Russians are to blame for this and the Russians need to account for this, all of a sudden, he's out. I think it crystallized for folks in the White House that there will be speculation on this for a long time. This one crystallized that we're just going in different directions, and they decided we're done.
So Tillerson wasn't the first member of the Trump administration to be fired in sort of an unorthodox way, and we can expect that he won't be the last. Does this harm Pompeo's credibility, assuming that he is going to succeed in Tillerson's role, Mike Pompeo, the CIA chief?
Well, it certainly puts some burdens on him and some demands on him, and it leaves people who are watching this to a lot of expectations. People are going to be watching to see what are the expectations and how does he meet them. There's sort of a big to be determined on Mike Pompeo's tenure. He's now been nominated. He's the secretary designate in formal terms. But I tell you, I'm going to be looking for a couple of things as he comes in. First of all, he's a member of Congress, a former member of Congress. That's good. That's a plus. He understands the role of Congress, and he should be able to understand how to cultivate those relationships that Secretary Tillerson probably learned a little too late into the game. So that will be helpful. The first thing I want to look for, and I would suggest others look for it too in judging how Pompeo takes off in this, is what does he do with the budget and the resources? If he goes up to Congress and he says, I want a 30% cut, I think we're in for another clash of heads and a clash of will with Congress. If he goes up and he says, I'd like resources to be sort of kept where they are, or maybe even let's take that 3% back a little bit, so that we know this institution is well staffed, so that we know we have the resources to do the job, that's a good sign. It will also help with morale. There's a second thing I'm looking for, because one of the issues that's been discussed with the State Department in the last couple of months is brain drain. There are a lot of high-ranking diplomats, people of serious expertise, who simply said they couldn't deal with this and they walked out the door. They retired, then that's it. They're hanging up the coat. Hold on. Any Secretary of State has about 400 positions. Undersecretaries, assistant secretaries, even deputy assistant secretaries, and ambassadorships that can be filled with people from anywhere, inside or outside the Foreign Service. If Mike Pompeo turns to some of those folks who left and says, hey, we need your expertise, we need your wisdom back, can you come back into the building? Our former ambassador to Panama, John Feely, I know the man. I've worked in the same building with him. John's a perfect candidate for Assistant Secretary for Western Hemisphere Affairs. There are other people who are perfect candidates to take over policy roles in the department. If Secretary Pompeo turns to them and says, let's get you back in the building, we'll give you one of the political appointee slots, we'll put you in a leadership position, that's a really good sign that he wants to bring back some of that expertise and talent. That's also going to do wonders for morale. The third thing I'm looking for has to do with policy. And that is, where does a Secretary Pompeo take policy on some of those contentious issues that we talked about a moment ago? If he decides to tear up the Iran agreement, if he decides to take an aggressive stance on North Korea, the signal you get is now that Foggy Bottom and the White House are much more in sync. That may be good for relations in terms of keeping those two institutions in the same track. The policy concern is, how do you play those policies out? I'll even give your audience one more to look for. If we replace the National Security Advisor, if the President decides that General McMaster is to go and replaces him in particular with John Bolton, you're going to see the return of what we used to call the neocons, the Rumsfeld, Cheney, Wolfowitz perspective on things. And I think that could create some serious tensions in foreign policy. So we'll see where this goes. There's some signals you can look for as we go forward.
Mentioning foreign policy, you had a lot of points to Pompeo, what he can do to succeed within the State Department to sort of rebuild morale.
And with Congress.
And with Congress.
Yep.
But what does he do to sort of gain the respect and ensure that he holds it of foreign leaders? There are some leaders here that are concerned that Trump's ability to just sort of fire people that disagree with him and things like that, they're not going to look at Pompeo as a man that is here to stay. They're looking at him as someone who could go at a moment's notice, so maybe that damages his credibility. How does he sort of sell himself as not someone who is just going to be a puppet for President Trump?
Foreign leaders are usually looking for two things, and they're lucky if they get one. The thing they'd really love to have is a policy that they like, agree with, and works for them and doesn't get them in trouble with their own publics or with their own relationships. And sometimes they get that and sometimes they don't. But what they really value out of the United States is consistency. This veering left and right, firing this one, firing that one. and the crossed signals between the White House and Foggy Bottom, where you get one story from one institution and another story from the other, that, in my experience, is what drives foreign leaders in foreign countries crazy. If they can at least hear some consistency, even if they don't like the policy, at least they know what the policy is. That will help. Then they can decide which way to go on it, but it's very hard to navigate in the middle of confusion. So if we can get some policy consistency, if we find that the White House and the State Department are at least reading from the same script, that will help in terms of stabilizing some of the confusion in foreign relations. They still may not like the policy, but that's the next argument that they'll have to have.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there. Professor, thank you so much for coming.
Thank you, Connor. It's a pleasure.
Thank you.